In today's Farm Report, beef exports to Mexico and Peru have reopened after a decades-long still because of concerns over BSE. Rod Bain with the U.S. Department of Agriculture has more.
We are excited about the opportunity to reintroduce beef into the Mexican market with the reopening of that market. We're also excited about the agreement that was reached with Peru, which is a companion agreement to one that we reached earlier with Chile on fresh and chilled pork.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack making the announcement that our meat exports are getting a big boost thanks to these recent trade agreements. It had been well over a decade since full beef trade to Mexico was closed down due to BSE concerns.
We expect and anticipate it might impact and affect 200 to 300,000 head. So that's obviously a good opportunity for a beef industry that needs those opportunities. We want to obviously continue to reopen those markets that were closed long ago because of the BSE incident. That we worked hard with the Mexican officials to get this to a point where they're willing to accept beef under 30 months, which is a good positive step.
And in the case of Peru, U.S. officials have been working since 2012 to assure the Peruvian government that our nation's fresh and chilled pork and pork products pose no risk to transmit parasitic roundworms, also known as trichina. This is USDA Undersecretary Ed Avalos.
Using sound science, using data obtained by APHIS and the pork industry, we're able to demonstrate to the Peruvian government that trichina was not an issue with our pork.
And the added exports to these two nations are expected to add millions of dollars to an already strong overall U.S. ag export value total. And as Undersecretary Avalos alluded to, much of the work to lift these barriers and reopen or expand these markets occurred through USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service using sound science and education.
The work that APHIS does is so important to our success in obtaining agricultural exports. We live today in a world of free trade agreements. We live today in a world of negotiations of other kinds, but so often countries will use a phytosanitary measure to restrict trade. And APHIS is instrumental in resolving those issues.
Secretary Vilsack adds that just last year alone, the work of USDA entities like APHIS paid off in increasing ag export opportunities, per a recent United States Trade Representative report.
The report that the USTR office issued indicates that the United States Department of Agriculture was very busy last year in breaking down and moving over 120 trade barriers, impacting $6.4 billion worth of trade potential. That's one of the reasons why we continue to see strong agricultural exports throughout the last several years and reaching record levels the last several years.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Demand for organic products continues to soar as new producers are entering the organic market. USDA Agricultural Marketing Service data shows there's more than 19,000 certified organic operations in the U.S. and a total of nearly 28,000 such operations around the globe.
And obviously, the organic trade is important from a twofold perspective. One, creating opportunities for our producers to additional market opportunities, which is why we entered into equivalency agreements with Canada and Korea and Japan and the EU. And now we're focusing on negotiations and discussions with our friends in Mexico.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack told attendees at the Organic Trade Association in Washington, D.C. Wednesday.
Organics is now sort of infiltrated throughout all aspects of USDA, and that's an important, I think, an important part.
USDA has a number of initiatives to connect organic farmers and businesses with tools like conservation support, access to grants and loans, and other resources. For USDA Radio, Susan Carter, Washington, D.C.
The U.S. is involved in two major trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which is beginning lots of press over the issues that still have to be ironed out, but the other trade agreement, the TTIP, which is between the U.S. and the European Union, is still got other things it has to get ironed out. Gary Crawford with the U.S. Department of Agriculture has more.
Coming up next week in New York City, round 9 of negotiations between the U.S. and the European Union for the trade agreement known as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP for short. There are many issues sharply dividing the two sides. One, of course, genetically modified crops, food and feed. The EU still very reluctant to open its doors to imported GMO products.
Yeah, this is a big political challenge.
EU Ag Commissioner Phil Hogan telling a USDA conference back in February that this issue is a real hot potato in the EU and not a GMO one either.
Even though the science might give validation, there's a big political issue, and civil society have major problems in relation to GM crops and GM technology in the European Union.
But Hogan said it would be in the best financial interests of European livestock producers to be able to buy the cheaper, more abundant GMO livestock feeds. And so, at least on that score,
we have a vested interest as well in making sure we can resolve this, because otherwise the soya bean imports to the European Union and all of the various ingredients for animal feed are going to go, substantially higher in price and going to make farmers less competitive.
So the U.S. and EU might come to a compromise on that. But at a recent House Agriculture Committee hearing, Dr. Howard Hill, president of the National Pork Producers Council, told lawmakers,
I'm not as convinced that we'll ever get the Europeans to back off.
But he said anything is possible. Another bone of contention, GI, geographic identity. European producers of certain food products and wines don't want any agreement unless it includes banning producers of similar or same products in other countries from using those original European geographic names, such as Parmesan cheese. At the same congressional hearing, Pete Kappelman with the National Milk Producers Federation told lawmakers his side of it.
A lot of our cheesemakers came from Europe, and we're making the cheeses that they made 3 or 4 generations ago. We've been promoting them. We've been marketing them. We've been building the market for those categories of cheese. And now they want to take that back. Well, I don't think Parma can make enough Parmesan to feed the world.
And on the EU side,
It's quite an emotional issue.
very emotional, but EU Ag Commissioner Phil Hogan says there's already agreement on 95% of the products involved, but
There'll be a handful of names, of course, that I'm sure will generate a little bit of excitement and heat.
and these are just 2 of the many issues dividing the EU and U.S. The EU doesn't want U.S. meat produced from animals given growth hormones. It doesn't want poultry and other foods sanitized with chlorine treatments, and the list goes on. In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
The future of agriculture, in the view of several national 4-H students, was presented Tuesday during a House Agriculture Subcommittee hearing on biotechnology, horticulture, and research. Among those testifying before the committee was 4-H member Gabriella Gurman of California, talking about the importance of educating everyone on the importance of ag.
I presented at a local elementary school career days, speaking about the dairy industry and agriculture as a whole. Through this, I've learned the importance of informing people about agriculture while they're young, so as to cultivate early understanding and support, bridging the gap between consumers and producers.
Lending support to the delegation was Deputy Agriculture Secretary Krista Harden.
During my travels and duties as deputy, I have met so many smart, talented young leaders. They inspire me and help me to know that our future is in good hands.
The National 4-H Convention continues in the Washington, D.C. metro area through Thursday. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture is lowering its export forecast for agricultural goods. Gary Crawford with the U.S. Department of Agriculture has more.
As Congress gears up for what will be a battle over whether to give the president so-called trade promotion authority, which means Congress could vote up or down on any trade agreement but not change it, agricultural leaders are out there talking about how important exports are to the ag industry and to farmers.
30% of all agricultural sales that take place in the United States are connected in one form or another to exports.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack got on the phone the other day with owners of businesses across the country and said in some years,
the level of export sales is roughly equivalent to the amount of net cash income that the farming community realizes from year to year.
And we may see that connection between farmer income and exports this year, but not in a good way. We now have the complete ag export numbers for the first 2 months of the year.
We had expected those to come down this year. That is indeed showing up in the data.
However, USDA's acting chief economist Rob Johansson told us the numbers are showing
a little bit higher than expected reductions.
The numbers for January and February, $23.8 billion in export sales, $3.5 billion less than the same 2 months a year ago. Johansson says there are several factors playing into this. First, the strong U.S. dollar making our goods more expensive in many markets and foreign ag products cheaper for consumers here, which means, of course,
we are likely to export fewer goods and services and import more.
And yes, the figures for January and February this year showing ag imports up $1 billion from the same 2 months a year ago, and our U.S. trade surplus currently running about half of what it was a year ago. So factor 1, strong dollar. Factor 2, weak prices for many U.S. farm products.
Even though our export volumes may be the same or actually even a little bit higher in the case of soybeans, the actual value of those goods has gone down this year.
And factor number 3, almost the entire world had a great production year this past season, providing more than the usual amount of competition in many markets and less need for some customers to buy farm products. And factor 4, that Western port slowdown.
Now, of course, that has been resolved, but over that time period, that was still resulting in reduce trade through those ports.
Now, during the first 5 months of the fiscal year, October through February, exports are running $5 billion below the year before, at $67.6 billion. For the year, our exports could be $9 billion below the year before. That's one reason so many ag leaders are pushing for new trade agreements, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which they say could give a big boost to U.S. ag exports, which, as Secretary Vilsack says,
are critically important to production agriculture and to the rural economy and to the American economy.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We've all heard some of the tales of Greek mythology, all the various myths, which of course have been proven to be just that, myths. Now we tackle some myths about a present-day food product.
There are a lot of myths out there about beef.
And this chef has a beef about those myths about beef. He's Dave Zeno, executive chef for the Cattlemen's Beef Board. He probably knows more about beef as a food item than just about anybody in the world. And he says the biggest beef myth is that beef is full of fat. Now, 40, 50 years ago, he says that might have been partially true, but not now.
Back in the 1980s, the outside fat trim on beef was about 1/2 inch. Now we're down to less than 1/8 inch. We've listened to consumers, health practitioners, and the industry has really come together, really from a gate-to-plate approach. There's genetics, breeding, there's feeding, cutting.
All combined to make beef much leaner than it used to be, so much so that according to Chef Zeno,
our lean cuts rank up there with chicken.
And that's no myth. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.